Rebecca Hodes is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Humanities in Africa and a research associate in the AIDS and Society Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. She did her doctoral training at Oxford and has written broadly and widely on the AIDS pandemic in and from the South African perspective. I was particularly noticing the title of one of your pieces called Antiretrovirals Are African Medicines, and thinking about the ways that we tend to look at the African subcontinent as a place that is somehow this collection of healing traditions, and often we don't think about the ways that biomedicine is actually a key part of what it means to practice African medicine. So I look very forward to hearing you talk a little bit about the history of that as it also intersects with a critical race theory and history of medicine.
Thank you so much, Sienna. And you put your finger directly onto really what is the key theme of my paper, I think, is in some senses how Western medical practices are assimilated within the colonial context. So thank you. Thank you also in advance to my interlocutors, Ishita and Mike. And if I may, just a quick shout out about Mike's book, The Educated Eye. It's really key reading for scholars of science and particularly of visual culture. And there's a chapter in here, for example, on photography and its use in medical pedagogy that I think many of us may find extremely helpful, so required reading. And perhaps we can have the PDF put up onto the website. And while I'm thanking people, my thanks particularly to Veronica and to Doug for bringing us together in this fantastic institute, which I think is in many senses really instructive in how to organize a program of this sort. I think the collegiality and the collective nature of how we've workshopped these papers and how we've organized these lectures is very much a lesson in exactly how to conduct these sorts of research projects. So thank you very, very much, and much appreciated, and really kind of profound learning experience for a very early stage academic. All right, what I'll start off with talking about is how my paper has narrowed and how my topic has changed. You may have noticed the differences between my proposal, which was about science, race, and sexual aberration, and the change in my chronology. And how that worked was that initially when I saw the call for papers, as Sienna has pointed out, my focus thus far has really been on very, very contemporary history in South Africa and the history of the HIV epidemic. I haven't focused much on earlier decades within colonial scholarship, so this is very much a new departure for me. I'm foraying into unknown territory for me. So please forgive me and understand that's where I'm coming from. But initially I saw the call for papers and the topic looked so interesting that I put together a proposal based on an article that I discovered from 1974 about a case of intersexuality in a herd boy. This was someone, a rural African who was a cattle herd, who was both an intersex patient. He was brought into the clinic, and also an albino. And it was such a fascinating write-up. His case study was, written up in the South African Medical Journal in 1974. I came across this and I thought, perfect. I'll go back, look at the rest of the articles from the South African Medical Journal, and I'll find other cases of sexual aberration. That was my hypothesis and my kind of departure point on which I based my proposal. And then when I got to doing the research, I went back to the journal and combed through 8,000 articles, so massive corpus of primary literature, and discovered that if I let the material speak for itself rather than imposing a particular hypothesis, what came to light was something quite profoundly different. There weren't many cases of sexual aberration as I'd hypothesized. What there were lots of cases of sexual difference. And as my paper explores, I'm looking at how that manifested with regards to reproduction and childbirth, and then sexually transmitted diseases, case studies, and the symptomatology thereof. So just to explain then that my topic has evolved based on actually grappling with the material. And in terms of the chronology, initially I looked at what Doug and Veronica had outlined as our chronology, the 80 years from 1880 to 1950. And it just became too momentous. So I had to whittle it down a little bit. And then I felt like it was quite neat, since the South African Medical Journal began its publication in 1884, which was, of course, the same year as the Berlin Convention, at which European powers apportioned Africa for conquest. And so it felt like a very neat and nifty way to begin in 1884, and then 50 years provided ample material and also brought us up to the onset of eugenics ideas and the impact of racial heredity and how that began to coalesce with different political organizations at the Cape leading up to the Second World War. So that's just a sentence or two about the change in chronology. What I'd like to do now is to frame my key hypothesis in the paper and then to take us through its principal sections. And I'm hoping that in so doing, I'll be able to structure our conversations. That if you could please, as I write down your comments and then look towards redrafting the paper, it might just be quite helpful for me if we can go in terms of those sections. It's just quite a sort of easy hook on which to peg our comments. Okay, my key supposition then is about the contingency of medical knowledge. And I argue, this is on page 16, scientific claims regarding race and sex were haphazard and contingent, confined by the rudiments of scientific knowledge and the shallow penetration of colonial authority. The confusion among doctors about the etiology of sexually transmitted diseases, and I'm just adding here, about the supposed biological distinctions manifest in organs of reproduction among the different racial groups, pointed to the mutability of scientific knowledge and the social stratifications that colonialism entailed. And I wanted to start off taking a point of advice from Rainer, with trying to give us quite an interesting visual. This comes from the South African Medical Record. It's an image that was done in watercolors in 1917, the return to the primitive. And I think it's such an interesting image that really incorporates some of the key points I'm trying to make here. Here you see a doctor, and this is someone who'll be working in the native territories, and instead of wielding a machine gun or a weapon, as we often associate with portraits of colonizers, he's got a walking stick. It's kind of indexical of the amount of walking and movement that he would have done in his encounters with native populations. I think it's interesting because it's also a portrait that uses some of those kind of visual tactics of ethnological portraiture, of someone who's facing the side. We have a kind of cross-section of this colonial figure. But it's also a portrait of quite a lot of nobility, of someone who looks assertive, but is not necessarily the embodiment of colonial subjugation and repression. I think this is a doctor who is immersed in the colonial encounter, but it's not straightforwardly here about subjugating local populations. And that is in essence what my paper tries to do. I'm not an apologist for colonial medicine by any means, but I think that it's quite trite and ahistorical in some senses to make the argument, so binary. We all understand that medicine and science were deployed to bolster certain racial hierarchies, to denigrate populations, to box people along both race and gendered lines. But I think that it's become far too monocausal and reductive and flat in some of our analyses. And this really is a call for greater richness in our appraisals, to problematize how medicine and science were deployed in the colonial encounter, how they helped to very much bolster racial hierarchies, but how they also started to buffet those hierarchies and to really challenge the received wisdom from metropolitan scholars. Okay, so that's my kind of key supposition. But of course, in writing the paper and then going back and rereading it, I realized that I'd fallen into the trap that Howard Chang sets up in his paper on double alterity. I have really fallen for this hook, line, and sinker. So not to preempt the critiques that I think might come up today, what I have done is this exact, I've really, I've done what Chang details here. It's a consistent blind spot of post-colonial scholars, that's me, who tend to take for granted the temporal continuum on which they interrogate the erotic sphere. For post-colonial historians of sexuality, the historicity of the concept of sexuality itself is often left unexamined. I think this is really an oversight and a key deficiency in my paper. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to signal ways in which I can address this. The concept is typically employed without probing the epistemological preconditions that make possible its articulation. So any advice that you have for ways in which to bring this back into my analysis would be much appreciated. But if I can throw down the gauntlet, perhaps in response to other scholars in our institute, it's to say that the other side of double alterity is to look at the foundational role of the distanced other. I think the distanced other really comes to the fore in my paper, whereas the epistemological preconditions coming from the sexologists working within the metropole have been sidelined. So I think what I'm trying to lead us towards is to bring in both of these kind of key strands and to unify them in our work. Okay, speeding forward then. My first section in the paper tries to provide a lot of background, and I think I'm really trying to situate diverse readers within the context of the Cape Colony to give you sufficient background information to kind of, keep you traveling with me as the paper moves on. There's a question then about whether or not I've given too much background and what you feel is superfluous, where you think I can cut. Please do, give me those directions. But I do try and set up the history of the Cape Colony to provide you with the necessary context, to travel along as the paper then moves forward. I also provide a kind of philological element, just thinking of how Dennis said that we've really brought elements of philology into much of our scholarship now. It seems almost seamless. But I realized when I read back that I look at the South African Medical Journal, and it's an incredibly rich, vast corpus of material. And the marvelous thing about it is that it's all available online in PDFs. You can't search for keywords, but you can look at the PDFs and find the articles there. And the South African Medical Journal is, a really interesting example of how, of how medical texts were being standardized and certain absolutes were being brought to the fore at the same time as local scientific knowledges were also becoming much more widely articulated and were positioned in a way that they could answer back to the theories and the hypotheses emanating from the metropole. And so I think Smuts's his quote there is profoundly interesting about the use of science in the kind of enunciation of new national identities. He speaks of the South Africanization of science and uses the sense in which Africa is this terra incognita, that it is such a profound and rich source of potential new information, to start to talk about the local prescriptions of knowledge. And I think the ways in which scientists and doctors then deploy that in their investigations is profoundly interesting. And the South African Medical Journal provides a lot of those case studies and of the symptomatology of both reproductive distinctions along racial lines, and also then, of course, with regards to sexually transmitted infections, which become a panic, a growing moral panic emerges around the South African War, which is why I talk about that in the paper. I think it's very important to look at the role of colonial conquest, and particularly of the role of this conflict that occurred in the Cape Colony, and then of the epidemiological entailments that took place thereafter. Okay. How am I doing? I'm going to speed up. I'll speed up quickly. Okay, in the second section then, maybe another 5, I'll take 5 more minutes. The second section is about buffeting the racial pyramid. And I realized in reading this that, I kind of invoked this quite folkloric language about, the tale in which the 3 little pigs make their different houses and how the wolf comes and starts to blow against these houses. So I wonder what our colleagues in folklore studies would make of that. I'm kind of employing new polyvalent language and bringing that to bear. But in essence, it's a very interesting case about African vitality in particular, how African subjects were regarded as being more vital than European subjects, and of how that was an epithet of benefit in some sense, that Africans were stronger, they were more immune to certain diseases. But the profound ways, the complex ways in which those discourses were sort of brought back on themselves, and I address that in my next section then on the racial ideologies, the kind of ways in which that discursive work just performed kind of cartwheels, that Africans were set up in ways that spoke of their kind of physiological benefits, but then those also became means of detracting from African subjects. But I think the key point here is that the medical articles really resist a kind of consensus. They are far more adeptly characterized by dissensus than by consensus. And my question to you then is, does that come across clearly enough in my paper, or do I need to marshal more evidence? Because in working with the material, it's really starkly evident to me that there was no consensus. But does that come across? Do I make that point convincingly enough, or do I need to marshal more evidence from my sources? And if that is the case, then please just point out where it is that the argument seems anemic. Because in dealing with this very rich corpus of material, I had to really pick and choose which cases to quote from, for example. And I wanted to use as much primary material as I could, but was wary of going too far over the word limit. So do flag where it looks deficient, and I feel confident that I'll be able to go back to my sources and marshal evidence in favor of my argument. Okay, bringing us forward then to the conclusions. I think what I'll just say then, I think Sienna said this really eloquently in the introduction, that there's a tendency in scholarship to look at the rich ways in which African medical practices emerged, and how that relates to different cosmologies of health and healing. And that's often set up as a riposte to Western medical practices, which are not understood as practices, but rather as theories. So there's something that's very monocausal, quite reductive. We understand Western medicine as something that's very vertical, whereas anthropologists of medicine speak about the richness. And I'd really like to problematize that in this paper, to say that we're dealing with something that is very rich in its different characterizations, and I hope that comes through in the paper. And if it doesn't, then it's a failing, and I hope that I can address that. Okay, so just in terms of, I came back to Chang and was doing more reading about that. How do I situate the scientia sexualis in an adequate framework of the translational economy and global circulations? I do feel that I might have managed to situate us locally, but where I've fallen down is being able to trace the sexological entailments. So please, it's a plea for advice here. If you can help me to discern whose theories I should be using. I feel like Hirschfeld, Ellis, Bloch, Lombroso perhaps, all of these key sexologists will have had a lot to say. But in my lack of familiarity with their writings, I haven't managed to perhaps bring them in ways that I should and that I could. So please help me to understand how and where I can use their theories, and how they could be applicable, and how they can be brought into this case study. And then just lastly, as a contemporary historian, and one who really works in HIV, and as an Africanist, in some senses I've really felt like quite distinct from my other colleagues in the Institute. And I feel like I've been moving among you, but you've been kind and gracious enough to not single me out too much, and to allow me to work with you and to speak with you. So just to thank you for your generosity there. I feel like I've been quite welcomed. And I think I'll put that slide back up to perhaps help to frame the discussion. But I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk about this paper. As that little biography or my CV suggests, I've engaged very closely with some of these very issues. So it was very interesting for me to be able to engage with some of very similar material, but from a different context. And I should confess, in a very different way from how I would or have in the past approached this subject. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity to have this conversation. And I would also say that you've preempted many of the comments and critiques, etc. And that's an indication of how reflexive you are as a scholar. So I'm grateful for that as well. And I hope we can sort of move from there and generate a useful conversation. It was very useful to hear you spell out how you're thinking about the project now and going forward, and I particularly like the way you set up where you're coming from in terms of situating the complexity and the contradictions in the medical discourse about race and sexuality at this time. So I would say straight off the bat that I agree with you, as do many post-colonial critics, right, and race theorists, that race is complex and full of contradictions, and there are all these slippages and all of that, as we know. But when we say that, are we pointing to the mutability of racial ideologies to serve a variety of political ideologies, from outright racism to political liberalism? Or are we doing so to query the power of race as an ideological formation that we still live with in the world? And I think that's the question against which I'll be framing most of my comments, because I'd like to hear even more about that, right? So now I'm going to stick to text so that I can stick with the time. So what Rebecca does in this paper is seeks to focus on a single medical journal to describe how South African science developed in its own context in interaction with a discrete, racially charged social and political context, and how it in turn helped to shape a distinct South African national identity in the 20th century. The focus on one journal over many years is a fantastic strategy. I think it's great, and that helps to draw attention to the complexity on the ground, on the one hand, and also to highlight any shifts over time. And it would be I'd like to hear more on your main source, right? And you did a little bit of that here. And what is unique about this source, as you suggest it is? What was the nature of scientific publishing in South Africa at this time? Were there other comparable journals? Who were the contributors? And you do have a little bit of that later on in your material, but I think it would be good to have it up front. So with my comments here, I hope I can raise some questions that will help you restructure the paper on the basis of your own key ideas, and perhaps also look at some of your very rich material from a slightly different vantage point, against the grain, perhaps, as Amy suggested last week, and to clarify the intellectual states of your paper. So the paper offers several compelling suggestions, of which I will draw attention to 4, which I think might be useful in terms of restructuring the paper as you go along. So first, you draw attention to the, quote, dynamic interplay of the colonial encounter. You suggest that science cannot be viewed as a straightforward expression of colonial subjection, which is a great point and clearly made. In doing so, you force us to acknowledge that there is no such thing as a monolithic colonial science, but I'm wondering if you might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Critics of colonial science have argued that complex, shifting, and often contradictory political ideologies shape the nature of science in different colonial contexts. In this paper, the careful summary of the South African War and the shifts in the political structure thereafter, which you have fleshed out already, could maybe be developed in light of this insight, right? How is the science and the politics interacting? It would also add greater weight to this compelling argument about divergences between historical actors if we had more biographical information on some of the people that you're citing. What was their social position, their role vis-a-vis the state, their positions on the political context that is being described. So again, a set of sort of colonial science questions, but I think that might be useful in contextualizing the paper. So second, an important theme you draw on is that public health was mobilized by ideological rivals for the pursuit of different objectives, either with more coercive or more humane treatment of patients with venereal diseases. That is, again, there is no such thing as a unified colonial policy towards different sections of the colonized populations. While there are hints of this throughout the paper, we do not get a sufficient sense of the simultaneity in the differences of opinion, or whether we are talking about shifts over time. This partly has to do with the organization, I think, and you're rethinking your project already, and it was much clearer in your presentation. And I think partly it has to do with the contextualization of sources. So two things that might need your attention while you're revising. You could also focus more closely on maybe just venereal diseases. I think you suggest that it is your plan in the paper, and maybe leave out some of the other examples that are there and prove to be distracting, like the native ability to labor or to resist cancer, or which are just questions that you simply cannot answer in 7,000 words, right? In other words, I think your valuable ideas, which are beautifully put on page 3, how medical investigation both furnished and vacated racial architectures, would be clearer to the reader when presented with material organized along thematic lines and with a single example. So I really urge you to think about that. So the third big idea that I enjoyed was you suggest that inscriptions to racial and gendered hierarchies ordained by science, religion, and the ideology of empire were challenged through scientific experiments undertaken within the living laboratory of the Cape African colony. That is, there were tensions between metropole and colony, or that realities on the ground changed both race science and sexology. If this is a strand of thought that is pursued in the final version, you'll have to do what you've set out here, and you know that, so I'll leave it at that. And if you were to choose that, you would have to again say who are the specific people who are being rebutted and to what end. In this regard, I have also a minor question about your use of Helen Tilley's description of Africa as a living laboratory, which can be understood as a highly problematic description in some ways, especially in the context, I think, of race science. I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about what Tilley is suggesting in the use of her term. What does it mean to say Africa is a laboratory for medical science instead of a site for the practice of colonial science? What exactly are the differences there? And in a context where science might have developed under the patronage of a colonial state and responded to the ideological and political commitments of that state. So I totally understand your need to jettison the old model of sort of the George Vasala colonial science model, where there's diffusion, etc. But you also do refer to scholars such as David Arnold and Megan Vaughan, who have highly developed arguments about colonial medicine, which is by no means about this sort of binary opposition, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about those scholars of colonial science. And I was also wondering, as I was reading this, if you have thought about Warwick Anderson's work, Cultivation of Whiteness, a work that I think is useful because it deals with a settler colonial context. It traces the development of Australian national medicine very carefully, in close dialogue with local political developments, right up to the White Australia policy in the early 20th century. So the fourth theme that I enjoyed, Rebecca points out that in her conclusion that scientific knowledge on racial and sexual difference was evolving in the Cape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a way that allows us to comprehend the role that science played in the consolidation of new national, and one would assume racial, identities in South Africa. Again, here you draw in your sources and your information on the South African historical context. I think you could do that a little bit more effectively instead of leaving that as separate discussions, to elaborate on, again, the transformations and the attitudes of the state toward African-speaking colored and native populations. So I think these 4 themes that you highlight in the introduction, the dynamism of the colonial encounter, the emergence of Africa as a living laboratory, the challenge to metropolitan thought by South African medical experts, and the emergence of a discrete national science in South Africa could perhaps be used to organize your paper, but of course you can throw out that, yeah. So because these thoughts, I think, get drowned a little bit in the middle portion of your paper, which makes up the bulk of your paper. And I think that happens because you do let your materials speak for themselves. And I know that you just explained why you do that, because the materials are more complex than the ideas you approach the material with. But what happens is that because you do that, there are some sources, I think, in the second part of your paper that seem to be in conflict with some of your conclusions and introductory statements. And one of the examples that I have in mind is that on pages 8 to 10, you point out her particular arguments about native physiology, the ability to work long hours, not feel pain, have easy labor, had long been marshaled in the defense of slavery amongst doctors in the United States. But on page 12, what appears to be a very similar claim about the natives' vitality and powers of recovery is, I think you try to read it in a completely different way, and I think you can. But what you need to do there is engage in some very close reading to guide us through the material and say, how is it that you're reading what seems to us to be very similar material in a very different way? And I have similar comments on the quote from David Livingstone on page 23. To me, and this is obviously an entirely subjective reading, this quote could easily be read as an example of a highly racialized understanding of pathology that draws on climactic and biological notions of the racial basis of disease. And I would tend to think that given Livingstone's status as a British imperial hero and explorer, besides being a missionary doctor, and the fact that it was funded by the British government, would sort of justify that kind of other reading. But I think even more importantly, do you really need him there? Because this is from 1857. So the easiest thing might be to just leave him out. So this type of closer reading and a bit more of your of the author's voice would help the reader. And this is the case even with the images on page 19 and 20. And I'm assuming you're planning to do that because you just encouraged us to read this book. So images can obviously be a powerful source, as we all understand. And Sandra Gilman, as we know and we've talked about it, used images of the Hottentot Venus to write of the creation of racial and sexual difference. Now, more recently, Sadia Qureshi has suggested of Gilman's reading that, and I quote her, the use of explicit visual material with little supporting discussion can appear voyeuristic. And Foster Sterling, in an implicit critique of Gilman's approach, refused to use images of Parkman because, quote, including such visual material would continue to state the question as a matter of science and to focus us on Barkman as a deviant. Who could avoid looking to see if she was really different? Sterling writes, right? So here with your 2 images, and I think you should use images, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't, we need a lot more explanation from you as to what the images are doing, because the reader is faced with the same problem, are they to ask, are the men in picture 1 of better physique than the men in picture 2? We might ask if visual photographic evidence is confirming the truth of the claim in the caption. Or is the reader meant to understand that we are faced with a colonial medical way of comprehending health, or who is to say what better physique might mean in a system that is not built on visual evidence, or on a medical system that might not concern itself, or a way of comprehending a body that might not concern itself with organs or muscles, right? But I think that would take you too far away from your project, and I'm not suggesting that you do that. But what we do need is a more pointed, historical, critical, the questions that are being addressed by you, which might perhaps be about the newness of the use of photography in this context, or something along those lines. So just to summarize my suggestions, I urge you to engage with fewer examples, shorter quotes. Don't let your materials speak for themselves, because then the reader can just read your materials very differently the way you intend them to. Perhaps a more thematic organization of the paper with the 4 or 5 main ideas that you engage with in the introduction and conclusion. Again, the question which I started with about when we say race is complicated, why are we saying that, and where are we going from there? And how would you tie the specific developments in medical science or public health in South Africa, specifically with the specific racial and gender structures and political ideologies that entail in South Africa? And finally, the large, the one big question, which is about the workshop, which you have up there already. What are the questions that tie this paper to the larger questions that we've been addressing as a group in terms of understanding sexual science and global genealogy, which might be important for you in terms of contextualizing and comprehending your more specific material. So, thank you.
I want to start by thanking Rebecca for sharing this paper with us. I think it's a fascinating and evocative study, and I found something to say on every page. But I'm going to focus here on some points that I think will hopefully aid our discussion, and then tomorrow Rebecca and I can talk about everything else that we want to. So Rebecca offers us a rich analysis of 5 decades of the South African Medical Journal as a means to assess shifting medical and scientific attitudes regarding race and sexuality. Focusing on reports concerning physiognomy, racial difference, and sexually transmitted disease, Rebecca navigates a very large set of primary sources to extract an image of scientific and medical practice in colonial South Africa that is both complex and nuanced. One of the great strengths of this approach is that she has not narrowed her attention to a representative physician or a small group of them. Instead, she grapples with a number of reports from the journal and the diverse perspectives of many individuals. As a result, we don't get a universalizing narrative based on a single or even a small number of authorities. So to answer your question, yes, the variation came out, and I think that's great. So you give us a great example of this kind of analysis in your discussion of the Collective Investigation Committee on Frontier Medical Association. This is where a number of different physicians report on their experiences with the treatment of syphilis in the colony. Curiously, on page 16, when the physicians respond to the question of which race appears to be affected, the physicians seem to all report the particularities of different African racial groups. In doing so, they reinforce an association between pathology and race, and this is how you read them. Yet on page 18, when the same physicians, I presume, were asked about classes of the community, in other words, which classes are more affected by syphilis or less, the answers are very different. They're not racial. Some physicians say that syphilis occurs among everyone in the community. So within the same report from 1888, we have a range of opinions that almost seems to be evoked or caused by whether the physicians are asked explicitly about race or in terms of class and other social division. So this is one of the sort of downsides to this approach. Just that one case alone demands greater analysis. So the downside for the entire approach is that the expansive narrative needs more contextualization. So as a historian, I want to know more about every actor. I want to know their training, their lives, their experiences, how they were received within the larger scientific and medical community in South Africa and everywhere else in the world. Who were the physicians reporting in the 1888 committee, for instance? What were their experiences in South Africa after medical training? Were they British expatriates? Did they run clinics or work for mines? In other words, what range of conditions shaped their thinking about race, class, sexuality, and nationalism, especially with regard to a morally loaded illness at the time, which was syphilis? I really appreciated your efforts to analyze attitudes toward race and sexuality within this community. Given the context of the Institute, I'd like to see more of your work on sexuality and how you think this figured in this journal. For instance, in the section of your paper where you discuss attitudes toward physiognomic differences, you explicitly evoke sexuality when discussing gynecological and obstetric investigations, so female cases. Male sexuality and issues of masculinity are implicit in your discussion of how physicians reported on black vitality and insensitivity to pain. I think you can make more of the intersection of race and sex here by drawing out how these physicians brought their ideas of masculinity to bear on medical assessments of South African men. This would help explain why these physicians seem drawn to describe suffering and to do so in heroic terms. So consider the case of the description of pain and sensitivity that allowed a man to work in a mine all day only to die that night of peritonitis. The writer is imposing a model of heroic masculinity that I doubt the guy who died shared, right? So that's sexuality being imposed also, and I would like to know as much about that as I know, as you tell us about the female sexuality or ideas about that are imposed in the obstetric cases. On the gynecological, your case regarding physiognomy could be developed further with a more detailed discussion of Sarah Bartman and her place in both European and African medical communities. You mentioned Cuvier's anatomical theories without going into much detail on his exhibition of Bartman's genitalia or of her as a person before death. This infamous episode needs further elaboration, especially since it seems to be an important point of connection between European scientific authority and South African medical attitudes. Were South African physicians explicitly making reference to the exhibition of Sarah Bartman? Was this the result of training in Europe? A more detailed discussion of European attitudes would help contextualize the material you described from the South African Medical Journal and help your readers understand how South African physicians seem to be adapting and responding to European ideas, while also allowing you to say more about how race and sex intersect and become mutually constitutive of these kinds of medical studies that decompose women's bodies. This process of dialogue with European traditions also comes up in your discussion of eugenics, race mixing, and syphilis. You describe how these issues appear in the journal, but I think we need more of a narrative about how the authors in the journal came to their ideas. We need to understand more about the development of eugenics in South Africa. Saul DeBow, for instance, describes how syphilis was understood by eugenicists in South Africa and elsewhere to have a congenital form, one that seemed to be passed down from mother to offspring. So you could catch it from your mother, or you could catch it from a partner. This made it a supposedly natural topic for eugenicists. Although it should be noted that the bar for something counting as heredity is notoriously low for eugenicists. American eugenicists would read newspaper obituaries and find traits that were noted, and that would make them hereditary, like love of the sea, love of reading books, love of music. All of those became hereditary just from obituary reports. At the same time, Europeans like Eugen Fischer from Germany published a well-known study of race mixing in what is now Namibia that had a strong influence on ideas of the harmfulness of race mixing in South Africa. These ideas were picked up by South African eugenicists such as H.B. Fantham and Annie Porter, husband and wife team of biologists from Wits. Indeed, DeBow suggests that the work of European eugenicists may have had a disproportionate impact in South Africa because, quote, the number of intellectual elites was relatively small and scientific access to decision makers was more immediate. This is not to say that South African intellectuals were simply adopting European ideas. So you still get to keep your colonial interpretation, or of the diversity of interpretations. DeBow describes South African eugenics as displaying hybrid vigor. So hybrid vigor is actually a super clever pun on his part. So you get hybrid vigor when you have two inbred families and you breed them together, and then the offspring, which are called outbred, are actually superior to both inbred parents. So this is the basis of corn biotechnology and all sorts of other things. In the when it gets applied to race, though, it's problematic, because what that would then imply is that race mixing produces superior offspring. And so biologists had hybrid vigor for everything, elm trees to corn to pigs to cows, but they had to draw the line when it came to humans because that was exactly opposite of what they wanted. So they had to invent arguments to get around this. So nevertheless, DeBow wants to say that eugenics as a field had hybrid vigor. So there was some sort of enriching hybridization that has its origins in the new South African context and many variants of racial thinking, he says, that existed within the colonies. So I think your analysis of 50 years of the journal supports this kind of interpretation that moves us beyond a core periphery model or even a unidirectional colonial science model to understand how scientific ideas were adapted and diversified within a local context. I think this point can be even more powerfully made with a bit more description of the transit and transformation of these ideas and practices. Given how rich your source is, I think I agree with Ishita that you have to focus down onto one of these three areas. Either has to be the physiognomy, the eugenics, or the syphilis in order to make your case. I'm worried that there's just been a good book by Karen Jolkelson on the history of syphilis and race in South Africa, and so I wonder what would be different that you would contribute there. And I also worry that Saul DeBow seems to have South African eugenics also very well wrapped up, which sort of leaves the physiognomy case as the most original material, which I think is very rich, especially given the incredibly large literature on Sarah Bartman and female embodiment. So, great work. Thanks.